I'm Philip Hughes, the chair of the Maroondah Interfaith Network in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne. This seminar was presented on the 15th of October 2023 at the Jansen Spirituality Centre. The week before the seminar had been heavy. We'd seen the relationship between Israel and Gaza descend into war, with several thousands of people killed, many thousands injured. Apart from the great disruption to life, the destruction of homes, and the generation of enormous fear. At the heart of the crisis is the sense of difference. Islamic versus Jewish, Israeli versus Palestinian, rather than seeing each in their common humanity, each concerned about making a living, having a future, caring for a family. The role of our interfaith network is to recognise our common humanity while acknowledging that we have different traditions, different backgrounds, we speak different languages. The day before the seminar was a referendum, which was about recognising the First Nations people in the Constitution of Australia as being the original habitants of the land, and about this being practically expressed through a voice which would advise the government relating to their particular needs and interests. Both those who advocated no to the referendum and those who supported it claimed that they were fighting for our common humanity. However, in that very struggle, common empathy and compassion and the sense of common humanity was broken. And the task from this point will be to mend the nation and to work to eradicate racism, and at the same time to recognise that we do not all have equal opportunities in Australia, and that much needs to be done to ensure that this occurs. We also face common social problems. The major threat of violence in Australia does not come from overseas powers. It occurs within our homes. Domestic violence is one of the major killers and disruptors in this country and occurs in all sectors of society. I'm delighted that the Maroondah Council is taking some initiatives in this. It is something that we should all be concerned about, and it needs a cultural change to remove the threat of violence. And that's something that everyone needs to be part of. Annette Degenhardt is the council officer responsible for the Freedom from Violence project, to tell us about the project and how we can collaborate in it.
Hopefully today I can give you some context around the issue of family violence and what the new model, I guess, that's been the Victorian government are trying to roll out in a prevention space, and then we can have some discussion about what that might look like. Firstly, I would like to start off with our official acknowledgement. In the spirit of reconciliation, I acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as traditional custodians of the land on which we are gathered today, where Indigenous Australians have performed age-old ceremonies. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present. When I present, I also like to acknowledge the terrible impact of family violence on individuals, families and communities, and the strength and resilience of the children, young people and adults who have and are still experiencing family violence. I thank those that have shared their stories and done an immense amount of advocacy, which has shaped Victoria's response. I pay my respect to those who did not survive and to their family members and friends. It's also incredibly important to acknowledge that there are groups of people that are disproportionately impacted by family violence, including the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, the LGBTIQA+ community, people with disabilities, CALD communities, younger people and older people. And within all of these demographics, women experience violence at much higher rates. Also like to start all of my presentations by acknowledging that discussion of any kind about family violence can be potentially triggering for people. Happens at such a wide, it happens at all areas of community, and the chances that people have been touched by that in some way anytime I present are very high. Your safety and well-being is the most important thing, not listening to me speak. So if you need to leave at any point, please feel free to do that. I would never ask questions about that, but I am here to speak about that afterwards if you need some resources or support. I also just like to offer the information that sometimes people like to share personal stories because it does help to provide context around what we're talking about, but personal stories can also be particularly triggering. So just have a little think about that before we share, just in case it may not be the right context for that. And also just advocating for you to use some self-care when needed after the discussion. And that looks different for everybody, but it can include things like deep breathing, going for a walk, talking to friends or families. And I have popped a couple of services up there that you can ring if you need to talk to someone who has expertise in this area. So today I am going to talk a bit about understanding what family violence is and the language that we use, because there are a lot of terminology thrown around, and sometimes it can get a little complex around what that actually means, and there's some nuance in that. I'm going to talk about what the problem is, what's been identified as the underlying root cause of family violence, and then the solution. And then I'll discuss the Family Free from Violence local government program that I am a part of, and how that's implemented. And then we can have some discussion after that. So firstly, just really important to start off with some key terminology. Domestic violence is the term that most people are probably familiar with. We're shifting towards the term of family violence. The reason for this is, and they're used interchangeably, but family violence is the term that's used to acknowledge the broader term of violence that occurs within a family setting. So often when we talk domestic violence, people automatically think intimate partner violence, so between a couple, but family violence is any violence that occurs. So it could be between partners, it could be from a parent to a child to a parent, it can be sibling violence, elder abuse. So that's why we like that term, because we are talking about all family violence and not just intimate partner violence. Gender-based violence is the language we use that's to reflect violence that's occurring on the basis of gender. So it is violence against one person because of their gender, and that includes violence against women. It also includes violence against men, and it includes LGBTIQA+ violence. The violence against women is a subcategory of gender-based violence, and it's specifically related to when violence occurs towards a woman. It doesn't mean that the violence is necessarily perpetrated by a man, but statistically speaking, that is most often the case. Violence against women is often used when we are talking about family violence because of the prevalence of it. So the majority of family violence that occurs is towards women and children, which is why we add that as a separate, my program is the Free from Violence program that is against family violence and violence against women, because the crossover there is so high. And intersectionality is understanding that people's experiences are shaped by an intersecting number of social conditions, and that each of these factors influence lives and experiences. So how we apply that in a family violence setting is looking at things like, we know that women are more likely to experience family violence, but an Indigenous woman is more likely to experience family violence than a Caucasian woman. That's just the way it is. Disability as well. So we're looking at those intersecting factors and how that looks for people, and also that the types of violence people experience differ, because, for example, violence against someone with a disability may be something like restricting mobility aids, which someone who does not have that kind of disability is not going to be subject to that kind of violence. So it presents differently as well for different groups of people. A little context around the issue of family violence in Australia. So police respond to an incidence of family violence every 6 minutes in Australia. To give a little thought bubble around that, that's only the reported cases. So you can imagine, particularly when family violence is occurring on a regular basis in a family, that would have to be pretty severe for somebody to call in those instances. So if they're responding every 6 minutes, I don't know how frequently it's happening, but it's significantly higher than that. Family violence is also the leading cause of homelessness in Australia, and that is women aged 55 and over are the fastest growing population of homeless people. And there are many gendered factors around that. On average, one woman is killed every week by their current or former partner. Unfortunately, a couple of years ago, we used to say it was one woman every 10 days, and now it's one woman every week. It has gotten worse. And when death does not occur, victims are impacted by disabilities such as ABIs, chronic health issues, mental health issues, substance use, pregnancy loss, and self-inflicted injuries. Violence against women and children is considered to be a problem of epidemic proportions in Australia. You may have heard this term, not all men are violent, but most violence is perpetrated by men. And the reason we talk about that is that most family violence is perpetrated by men, and that is violence against women and men and children. But in general, most violence within the population, when it's not family violence, is also perpetrated by men. So it is a cultural issue that we need to look at around why violence is occurring as perpetrators so highly in that demographic. And when we are talking about violence against men in a family violence setting, it's really important to note that that typically is not happening from a partner. So violence against men is more likely to occur because it is perpetrated by a parent, a sibling, and other family member. It is not typically in an intimate partner setting. It is in different ways. So when we are, presented with potential violence against a man in a setting, it's going to more likely be from someone else in that family unit, often because they're a child and it's happening from an adult towards them. So in terms of forms of violence, it's also really interesting to know the different forms and what that looks like. And I think this is particularly worth knowing. And I have got a couple of examples here, but I would highly recommend going onto the Safe and Equal website because they break all of these down and have really distinct examples of each. Because there are certain things that are really difficult for people to describe as violence and people understand that as violence. And they may seem like it's a typical behaviour that happens in a family unit. So we call that coercive control. Which is not a distinct form of family violence, but it's a pattern of abuse that perpetrators use to control, manipulate, and dominate. And the tactics instill fear, wear down a sense of identity and independence, and entrap victims in a violent relationship by closing off options for accessing safety and support. Coercive control is really complex. It includes behaviours that a victim survivor considers abusive but may be hard for others to identify. And it makes it hard to consider as evidence or to prosecute within the criminal justice system. I believe that Queensland have just made coercive control, they've just put some policy in around coercive control and it being a term recognised within their legal system. It's not consistent across all of Australia though, and to my knowledge, Victoria doesn't yet have that. So some forms of violence are blatantly illegal and others are not. And some of them are considered normal. For a little bit of background, I am a youth worker prior to this role, and when I was reading through this list, it was jarring to read about how many things are considered violence that young people in particular consider a normal part of their relationship. So that's, again, another reason I would really look at the list, because there may be things that you hear people talk about that they don't necessarily recognise as violence, and we may not either until you start to understand how this all works together. So emotional violence, some examples are name calling, embarrassing your partner or family member in front of others, or threatening self-harm. that one is quite common in relationships with young people. Physical violence is smashing or destroying things, recklessly driving while someone is in the car with the intent to intimidate or scare them, and neglect of someone in your care. Sexual violence is pressuring someone, unwanted touching, or disclosing intimate knowledge or images with others. And some of that is illegal, especially sharing of images. There's some more work being done in that space. Social violence is excessive questioning. Again, that's quite common with young people as well. Where have you been? Why don't you tell me? They have all these apps that track where they are, and they need them to be turned on. Using someone's sexuality or gender identity against them and monitoring movements. Financial is denying someone access to money, including their own. Selling someone's possessions or preventing someone from earning money. And spiritual, ridiculing someone's beliefs, manipulating religious teachings, or preventing someone from participating in ceremony. So I know I've talked a lot about all of the stats, and that is, difficult to hear. What I take comfort in is that we have a model that we can work to make that better. So family violence, as I mentioned, refers to all forms of violence that occur within a family setting, and what the evidence is showing us is that family violence occurs when there's inequality in the family unit, which is why the demographics that we see that happen to is violence against women, because there is an inequality between women and men, towards children, again, inequality, elder abuse, so older people being abused by their children or other members of their family when they are in care settings, for example. So because gender-based violence is the most prominent form of family violence, they have identified the drivers of gender-based violence, and Our Watch is a really fantastic organisation that has done extensive research into this as well, and they have the 4 drivers of gender-based violence. So it's also important to acknowledge that family violence is not caused by any one factor, but as more of these drivers are present, the probability of family violence increases. So the first one is the condoning of violence, and we commonly hear that spoken about when people say, well, she should have left, or they should have left. An example of how that's been portrayed in the media is there was an article in December last year, and I have completely forgotten his name. Jeremy Clarkson, thank you. When he wrote about Meghan Markle, and he said he was dreaming of the day when she is made to parade naked through the streets while crowds chant shame and throw lumps of excrement at her. That's a really violent thing to write, and it was publicised in an article that went out to thousands and thousands of people. That is an example of condoning of violence. Another one is control of decision making. So the idea that that men make better leaders, or that a particular culture are better leaders than others. So there was BBC headline in January this year when Jacinda Ardern resigned, and they were all variations of Jacinda Ardern resigns, can women really have it all? Which is not really a question that is ever asked of men when they're in a leadership position. So rigid gender roles is another driver. So the idea that men are providers, women are carers. And this is David Bashir, and he recently said in the Women's World Cup about one of the soccer players, certainly motherhood has not blunted her competitive instincts. Again, something that we just wouldn't hear spoken about gender. And then cultures of aggressive masculinity. So I always find it important here to talk about, we're not talking about masculinity is not inherently bad. It is toxic and aggressive masculinity that is harmful to everybody. And if you don't know, that's Andrew Tate. If you don't know of him, that's great, because he's not a nice person. And he wrote, the masculine perspective is you have to understand that life is war. It's a war for the female you want. It's a war for the car you want. It's a war for the money you want. So these are just some really recent examples of how these drivers of violence are in our lives all the time. And the more that you are aware of them, the more that you see them happening. So what we do know though is that with our drivers, we have essential actions, things that we can build into what we do, not only in our personal life, but in our work life, to combat these and start to look at how we change that culture. So condoning of violence, we challenge the condoning of violence against women with actions that do that. So that could be calling it out. There could be particular messaging that we give to people. It really depends on the context of how of the work that you do or how your life operates, but that's the essential action. For control of decision making, it's promoting women's independence and decision making in public life and relationships. So for example, there's new gender equality action plans that organisations need to have. So in Maroondah City Councils, we have actions in there about leadership opportunities for women, because we have a majority women employed at Maroondah City Council, but not a majority in leadership. So that's what we're looking at, that disparity there. So cultures of toxic masculinity, so supporting men in developing healthy masculinities and positive male peer relationships. A really great example of that is men's sheds. So that idea of supporting one another, being together and talking and, really allowing men to discuss how they're feeling and be amongst peers in a positive way. And rigid gender roles is building new social norms that foster personal identities not constrained by rigid gender stereotypes, which is very wordy, but an example of how I have two children. I have a nearly 6 and a nearly 3-year-old, and my 6-year-old boy is right into trucks, cars, loves them. From the minute he could crawl, he would make his way over to the window when the garbage truck came down the street. Very stereotypical boy. He also loves nail polish, and we paint his nails and he wears nail polish because that's fine. And that is an example of not constraining him to this gender stereotype that because he is a boy and he likes trucks and he likes things, that he can't also like to wear nail polish. So I'm not sure if anyone who's heard about primary prevention is familiar with this. So this is what the new model and I guess what the funding that that funds my role is really about. And it is a shift. It's really exciting shift because historically the money has gone into response, which is understandable because we need it and we still don't have enough to respond to family violence settings. But the hope is that if we invest in primary prevention, we won't need as much response because we are shifting the culture. So primary prevention is upstream, and sometimes that can be really difficult to see the link between projects that we're doing and how they link to family violence. And the other thing I guess that's can be a little tricky to get your head around is that it is a long term. So we're not going to be seeing this change in 12 months. We're looking 10, 15 years down the track at how this manifests. So it works by identifying the underlying causes of violence and changing cultures across the whole population, not just the behaviour of people who perpetrate violence, but all of us as a culture. And that's where those drivers of violence and those essential actions come in. So promoting gender equality, education on respectful relationships, challenging community attitudes to family violence, tertiary response, early intervention. They support victim survivors of family violence and hold people who use violence to account. And same as response. So that's specifically, it's a bit narrower. It's for people who are in that environment. It's not a whole of system approach. And it's done with the aim of preventing recurring violence or minimising its long-term impacts. It doesn't stop it from happening. It's still kind of putting something into to prevent it from getting any worse. So things like intervention orders, safety planning, crisis response services, and criminal charges. So that's your early intervention and response. And then recovery is for people who have experienced it who are now not in that situation, and we're supporting them to gain that autonomy in their life back. So primary prevention I find really exciting. I find it would be really hard, and I have a lot of respect for people who work in early intervention and response. That would be a really difficult place to be. Primary prevention gives me hope that we can make change and that we can see things happening. We just need it to be spread far and wide and be a collective approach. So a little bit about the Free from Violence program. So it came about from the 2015 Royal Commission into Family Violence, which was conducted in Victoria. There were 227 recommendations that were made, and Victoria adopted every single one of them. So this saw the creation of the Free from Violence strategy, which is this second one here. And it included an action for local government around what we can do as a local government to prevent family violence from happening. So funding was provided to create a resource, which is this third one here, which has a very long name. It is the Local Government Guide for Preventing Family Violence and All Forms of Violence Against Women. I just call it the guide because if I had to say that 20 times a day, it would take a long time. And we're in the pilot. So 15 councils across Victoria were provided funding to implement that guide. It's meant as a resource to implement primary prevention into your organisation. A second phase just closed, so a further 10 councils in Victoria will be funded to roll out this program as a second phase, which is really exciting because we haven't even finished the pilot, so obviously they're seeing benefits of that and rolling out another 10 councils. And meanwhile, the federal government was creating the newly launched National Plan to End Violence Against Women and Children in a Generation. So that plan supports the work being done in Victoria. And just a little side note, as heartbreaking as the decision was with the referendum, I was grateful to see that Victoria has the closest, most progressive view on that. Victoria is also the leading state for work being done to prevent family and gender-based violence, which also makes me really happy. I have been to a few communities of practice with practitioners in other states, and they have essentially zero funding to do any of this work. So it's great that we live in a state where we can be supported to do this. So the guide sets out a framework to implement primary prevention, and it's a whole of council approach that breaks it down into 4 areas, and we have actions under each of those 4 areas, and also looking at a sustainability model because we are funded for 3 years, which is not that long, but it's actually great. Normally in this space you get 12 months of funding, so 3 years is really exciting. So we have a 12-month action plan. We've just finalised our second year one, aimed at addressing the drivers of violence and essential actions in those 4 areas. And we did that through an organisational health check with our organisation where we asked every service area what they were doing, what could be improved. A lot of what came out of it was training and education for staff so that they could implement some of this work. And then we also went through advisory committees, which is where I met Philip, to find out what people wanted in the community. So I just wanted to talk to you about one project that we're doing. We have 12, I think, but some of them are internally focused around our policies and hiring practices and those kind of things. But the Diverse Image Library project, I really like to talk about because it's really practical and achievable. And it's also one of those projects that you don't necessarily see a link to the prevention of family violence, so it's a great way to explain primary prevention. So essentially what we did was an audit of major council documents and strategies, and we looked at the breakdown of gender representation in the photos, cultural representation, disability, age, intergenerational, so that we could get a bit of an idea of what we were displaying in our strategies and whether or not that was representative of the Maroondah community. And we also not only looked at how many times people were in those photos, but how they were presented in those photos. So there's a power dynamic that comes into photos as well, which is really important to look at. So for example, when children were shown, I can't remember the exact statistic, but it was something like 80 to 90% of the time they were shown with a female carer or caregiver. And that's something that we can, it's such a simple change, is get some photos of children with their dads. And then it really highlights to the community that dads are an active part in their children's lives, and that is a part of our Maroondah community, and that's what we support. So that's what we're looking at. There's also things like when we had pictures of First Nations people, it was often either because whatever strategy or document or action was talking about Indigenous people, or they were particularly doing a cultural ceremony. We didn't represent them just as community members going about their day. It was very specific and very targeted. So it's great that they're included, but they're also just a part of our community and do the same things that we all do. We don't need to always show them just doing a smoking ceremony. They're more than that. People are complex. So that's our diverse image library. That's one of the things we're working on, and we're trying to embed sustainability into that by developing best practice guidelines and a checklist that we can train our staff in, so that when they're choosing photos, they can go through that and think about these things more, so that it's not just me coming along and pushing that for 2 years and then it goes right back to where it started. People have tools that they can use. And we also really excitingly have a volunteer from our Kerribee. I don't know if anyone knows Kerribee, but it's the activities and social centre for older persons in Maroondah. There's a member there who loves to take photos, and we're looking at getting him on board as a volunteer to come out and take some photos for us that we can continue to use and develop and integrate that into how we collect those images.